a hidden manuscript, an unsolved disappearance, and a warning Agatha Christie never got to write. It was never published. It was never archived. And according to those who kept the records, it was never supposed to exist. But it does. And tonight, you'll see why that changes everything. The pages were dusted with time, buried beneath floorboards no one was meant to lift, wrapped in oilskin, sealed with a ribbon untouched until now. No title, no signature, only initials, and a date that shouldn't match what history claims. Miss Marple may be fiction, but the mystery she almost told was not. For the next hour, you'll uncover what was hidden in plain sight, but only if you pay attention, only if you stay until the final minute, because the last 5 seconds hold a truth so dark it was erased from her legacy, and yet it still found a way to write itself back in. This is the manuscript that shouldn't exist. Chapter 1, The Forgotten Pages. There are stories, and then there are the stories we were never meant to hear. Some are lost through time, some through accident, and others are hidden on purpose. But every so often, a sliver escapes. A line, a signature, a few faint pages, never printed, yet written with intent. This is one of those stories. In January of 1976, the world quietly mourned the loss of Agatha Christie, a name etched into the foundation of mystery fiction, a voice that guided readers through corridors of doubt, clues, and clever revelations. She gave us Hercule Poirot. She gave us Miss Marple. She gave us puzzles we never forgot. And then she was gone. Her home in Winterbrook, Berkshire, was emptied slowly, carefully, cataloged, preserved, books on shelves dusted, draft collected, and a life's work prepared for posterity. But there was something no one listed. No one cataloged it. No one signed for its recovery. Because officially it wasn't there, the discovery was almost accidental. A man named James Whitmore, a junior clerk at the time, now in his 80s, was helping to sort and pack the remaining personal effects from the attic. Old trunks, luggage, a child's pram with a bent wheel, and then a floorboard shifted. Not broken, not rotted, just loose. Beneath it, a hollow space. And inside, a wooden writing box, dark with age, wrapped in muslin cloth. He thought little of it at first. Many great authors keep notes. But it wasn't the ink that struck him. It was the initials. Just 2. JH, and below them, a faint sketch of a garden gate. Inside that box were papers. Thin, cream-colored, edges frayed, ink faded in places. But unmistakably, the handwriting of Agatha Christie. Not typed, not transcribed, not edited. Handwritten, with care, with emotion. Some of the pages were folded twice, perhaps once intended to be mailed. Others had rough cuts along the margins, as though pieces were removed intentionally. But the content, that's where the questions begin. This wasn't a short story, nor was it a novel in progress. It didn't match any notes in her archive. It had no official title, no known record. Yet the voice, those sentences, spoken a way only Christie could, wry, precise, laced with that quiet, observational sharpness that only Miss Marple was known for. Except this Miss Marple felt different. There was no village fair, no cozy parlors, no well-meaning vicar offering tea and gossip. Instead, there was a room she never left, a letter she never showed, and a question she never stopped asking. Why was this never released? Why was this manuscript hidden beneath the very floor where Christie once stood? Why wasn't it mentioned by her editors, her family, or her own journals? And why was it never meant to be found? There are a few facts we can confirm. The handwriting matches authenticated samples from Christie's late period. The pages contain phrases, unique to her style, that appear nowhere else in her published work. The name Marple is mentioned 12 times, but not once is it followed by a solution. Not once does the mystery resolve. There is no reveal, no confession, no tidy ending, just fragments. And on one page, something else. A margin note, barely visible now, smudged and written at an angle. Just 3 words, She got too close. No context, no subject, no clarification, just those words. And that was enough to unsettle Whitmore. He didn't know what he'd found, but he knew what he wasn't supposed to. He sealed the box and took it to the literary estate. They declined to comment. It was never mentioned again. Not in interviews, not in retrospectives, not in the authorized biographies. Only a brief line buried in a cataloging report. Unverified manuscript, presumed incomplete, no publishing interest. But some things are left unprinted for reasons that have nothing to do with quality. Sometimes it's about what they contain. The pages are still real, stored now in a restricted section of the British Library's private collection. No digital copies, no scans. Only those with formal approval may view them. And even then, only under supervision. But a copy does exist, photographed in sections before they were removed. We reviewed them, and what we found is what you're about to hear. Before we go on, I want you to think of this. If one of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century had one final story to tell, but never wanted it released in her lifetime, what would she be trying to say? And what, if anything, was she afraid of revealing? This manuscript begins with a woman walking alone in the garden. No time, no location, only this sentence. The rhododendrons were blooming late that year, and she knew why. That's all. No names, no crime, no suspect, just a sense that something was off. Not unnatural, not exaggerated, just wrong enough to notice. And in the way Miss Marple's stories often unfold, the details begin to stack. A neighbor that isn't really a neighbor. A man who never buys bread, but visits the bakery twice a week. A glove found on a statue that no longer stands. Each detail meaningless on its own, but together unnerving. Not loud, not showy, just enough to make the reader look over their shoulder. The further the pages go, the less clear the story becomes. Characters drift in and out, unnamed. Events are referred to, but never described. One line simply reads, "He always brings a watch, but he never looks at the time." Another, "She knew it would happen again, and still she left the light on." None of it sounds like the Christie we know, and yet it couldn't be written by anyone else. There's too much precision, too much control, too much purpose. What was she writing? Who was she writing it for? And what made her stop? Because the pages don't end with a period. They just stopped. The last line cuts mid-sentence. It wasn't her fault, not really, because when she opened that's it. No more ink, no more words. Only a smudge trailing into the margin. We don't know what she meant to say, but maybe she said enough. Enough for someone to notice. Enough for someone to ask why this story of all stories was kept from the world. If you were the one who found these pages, what would you do with them? Would you hand them over? Would you read them out loud? Or would you burn them unread? Because one thing is certain. Whatever Agatha Christie left behind, she did not intend it for entertainment. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It wasn't a game. It was something else. And if you're still with us, you're about to discover how far the shadow of this forgotten manuscript stretches. Because while the world turned its page in 1976, something waited in the margins. Chapter 2, The Letter That Disappeared. Before something vanishes completely, it always leaves a trace, a shadow in a drawer, a name removed from the call list, a silence where footsteps used to echo. Sometimes the absence speaks louder than anything left behind. This is a story of a letter, one that may never have existed, and yet it changed everything. Her name was Clara Matthews, a name mostly forgotten now, barely mentioned in memoirs, footnotes, or credits. But for 6 years, Clara was more than an assistant. She was the one who answered the door when the publishers called late. She organized the notes, sorted the drafts, and made sure tea was steeped exactly 5 minutes when Miss Christie was revising a scene. She was trusted, not with everything, no, but with enough. Clara knew the rhythm of Agatha's handwriting before the ink had even dried. She could tell the difference between a decoy clue and one that mattered by the slight press of a pencil's edge. She wasn't just typing. She was listening. And perhaps, in the end, that was a problem. January 7th, 1976. 3 days before Agatha Christie's passing. Clara didn't show up to work. She wasn't ill. She hadn't given notice. And she wasn't the type to take sudden holidays, not without a detailed itinerary. At first, it was chalked up to bad weather. The roads out near Winterbrook could frost over, and Clara lived on the edge of a wooded lane where phone lines dipped with every snowfall. But then the hours passed, and the snow cleared. Still no sign. When a neighbor let themselves into Clara's small cottage, they found the front door locked. Nothing was disturbed. Her handbag was still hanging on the back of the kitchen chair, her coat folded neatly by the hearth. But the kettle hadn't been boiled, and her bedroom window was open just slightly. Not broken, not forced, just unlatched. Like someone forgot to close it after leaning out for air, or like someone left in the middle of something. There was one other thing. A note, folded once, left on the desk, written in Clara's careful handwriting. She said it was only fiction, but I read the whole thing. No date, no signature, no other context. Just that. And on the bottom corner of the page, a faint circular ring, the kind left by a teacup. So, naturally, a question took root. What exactly had Clara read? When the estate was informed of her absence, their response was swift but careful, discreet. No public announcement, no appeals in the papers, only a few quiet inquiries sent through private channels. But within hours, a man arrived from London. No name, just credentials. He asked to collect Clara's belongings. He had a key, and he didn't ask for help. A neighbor said she saw him remove a stack of papers. Nothing more, and drive away without so much as farewell. That neighbor never gave an official statement. In fact, she moved away less than a month later. No police report was ever filed. No missing person bulletin printed. Clara's name faded out of footnotes the same way it had quietly entered them, but not entirely. Because 3 years later, an archivist reviewing a shipment from the Christie estate logged something unusual. An empty envelope, sealed in a folder marked Personal Correspondence, January 1976. The envelope had no stamp, no return address, just a single name written in looping script. Clara. Inside there was nothing, or perhaps nothing that remained. When questioned, the archivist claimed the envelope may have been an error, a placeholder, something that was misfiled, but no one could explain why it had been included in a shipment of legal documents. And no one ever found a matching letter, or any other trace of Clara Matthews. Not a resignation letter, not a journal entry, not even a forwarding address. She simply stopped appearing in records. But here's where things become more unsettling. Among Christie's effects was an annotated manuscript, the same one we discussed earlier. And on page 112, a curious edit, a sentence that was struck through once, then rewritten. The original read. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the teacup. The revision read. She burned it, but the scent lingered long after the flame. That change was made in pen, red, with a slight tremble in the stroke. It was the only revision in red ink across the entire manuscript. Every other mark was graphite. Why? Why would Christie, who famously edited in pencil, suddenly switch to red? And why that sentence? Could it be a coincidence? Of course. Could it be symbolism? Perhaps. Or could it be something more literal? Could it point to an action someone actually took? There's another fragment, one that most people overlook. In a letter dated months before her passing, Christie wrote to a friend, "There are things I may not publish in my lifetime, not for fear, but for decency. Sometimes fiction is the only veil we have left." It's a poetic line, cryptic, beautiful even, but what did she mean? What would require such a veil? And what happens when someone else lifts it? There is one theory, unconfirmed and proven, but passed quietly among archivists and researchers, that Clara read something she wasn't meant to, that she confronted Christie with questions, and that, in response, a letter was written, a letter that may have explained it all. The manuscript, the edits, the strange notations, and why it was hidden beneath the attic floor. Some say Clara took the letter with her. Others say she never got the chance. One man, an antiquarian bookseller in Cornwall, claims he once saw a letter matching description, sealed with wax and folded into the jacket of a first edition The Moving Finger. He said a woman brought it in, shaking, hesitant, and asked if it was real. He told her it was, and she never came back. He never got her name, but he remembers her eyes, like she'd read something that changed how she looked at everyone. That letter, if it existed, has never surfaced again, but rumors have a way of filling empty pages, and sometimes they're not wrong. What truth was so dangerous it had to be buried? And if you found the letter, would you read it? Would you keep it? Would you believe it? In one corner of the manuscript, near the edge of a water stain, someone wrote a note in all capital letters. It reads, "If this gets out, she'll never be remembered the same." No initials, no date, just that. Was it Clara's handwriting? Was it Agatha's? Or was it someone else entirely? We may never know, but the question lingers, like the scent after something important has been set alight and forgotten. What if the greatest mystery Christie ever crafted was one she didn't solve? What if the solution was meant to stay locked in a desk drawer, sealed in a letter, and delivered only when the world could understand it? But the letter never arrived. The drawer was emptied, and the trail went cold. Or, so they want you to believe. We'll continue this story. But you must remember this moment, because at the end of it all, when the final page is read and the final clue is laid bare, this letter, the one that vanished before it ever reached its reader, will return, not as paper, but as a revelation, one that may shift the way we remember everything else that came before it. Don't forget the envelope. Don't forget the name. Clara didn't just disappear. She read something that was never meant to be read, and what she left behind wasn't just silence. It was the beginning of the question no one wanted to ask. Chapter 3, The Marple Clue. What do fiction and truth have in common? At first glance, nothing. One is crafted, plotted, measured in beats and arcs. The other is lived, messy, unfolding in half-remembered moments in quiet, uncontrollable choices. But every once in a while, fiction and truth touch fingertips, briefly, delicately, and when they do, when a line on a page reflects something that actually happened long before the ink dried, it raises a question. Did the author imagine it? Or did they remember something the rest of us forgot? It begins with a sentence. One line, buried halfway through the manuscript we've now come to know was never published, never acknowledged, and never meant to be found. The line reads, "The killer always returns to the scene when no one is watching." A chilling idea, but not unusual in fiction. Writers use it all the time, a trope, a flourish. Except in this case, it was more than metaphor. Because less than a month after this manuscript was believed to have been written, a file was quietly reopened by Thames Valley Constabulary. A case from 1947, one that had never been solved, barely investigated. Officially, it was chalked up to a tragic misadventure. Unofficially, it had too many missing pieces to count. And one of those pieces, astonishingly, matched the detail found in Christie's hidden manuscript. She wore a brooch shaped like a moth. Only one wing was chipped. She always said it brought her luck. That description was nearly identical to the one listed in Forgotten Case File from January 19th, 47, archived in Box 36A, under the handwritten tag. Cold weather incident, no viable leads. That file described a young woman found unconscious in a snow-covered garden in Oxfordshire, beside a greenhouse long since demolished. She had no identification, no travel records, no witnesses, only that brooch, silver, shaped like a moth, one wing chipped, and lodged in her coat's inner lining. Her name was never discovered. She never regained consciousness. She was listed as Jane Winter, an assigned name, not a real one. The brooch was bagged as evidence, and her story shelved until now. The manuscript's passage, as we now understand it, is not just metaphorical. It includes the same month, the same location, and even references a glass house. One that had, in fact, been located near a manor in the countryside just 6 miles from Christie's estate. Coincidence? Or memory? Here's where it deepens. Agatha Christie had often taken long winter walks near that area. It was part of her routine. To clear her mind, to plot her novels, to listen to the silence between footsteps. She even mentioned it once in a letter to a friend. I find the frost settles best near Greenwick Lane, a fine place for secrets, if one were inclined to keep them. Greenwick Lane was 600 yards from where the woman was found. The same location, the same year, and now, decades later, a line in a secret manuscript that seemed to reference it all. What are the chances? How could she have known? And if she wasn't just imagining a detail, then what was she doing? Was it inspiration or recollection? And if it was recollection, what exactly had she seen? Now listen closely, because this next detail was nearly missed. Page 48 of the manuscript contains a sketch. It's rough, just a few strokes of pencil, a greenhouse, a stone path, and what appears to be initials JW. They don't match any character in the story. They're never referenced again. But in the cold case file from 1947, beneath the fabricated name Jane Winter, is a corner notation made in pen, barely legible. JW, no one can confirm who wrote it or when, but that repetition, across time and mediums, raises the one question that threads through every chapter of this unfolding puzzle. Was this fiction, or was this something else? The police never pursued the 1947 case again. Too much time had passed, too many files lost, but not everyone forgot. In 1989, a retired detective named Malcolm Grayson, who had been a constable in the Oxfordshire region during the post-war years, gave a single recorded interview. In it, he mentioned a woman who knew things she shouldn't have. A woman he described as elegant, precise, and far too clever for her own safety. He never named her, but at one point, the interviewer asked him to clarify. Did you mean a local? Someone from Winterbrook? Grayson paused, then said only, let's just say the stories weren't always made up. Why include this clue? Why leave it in the manuscript, unedited, unexplained? Could it be a signature, an admission, or was it a trap for those who looked too closely? The line returns again, later in the manuscript, this time altered slightly. The truth always returns to the scene when no one's paying attention. Truth, not the person, not the act. Truth, do you believe in coincidence? Or do you believe that some authors write what they cannot forget? That memory becomes fiction only because it's easier to digest that way? There are readers who believe this manuscript is not a story at all, that it's a map, a coded recollection, a riddle designed not to be solved by the masses, but by one reader, the right reader, and that perhaps if you line up the moments like constellations, you begin to see the outline of something else. Not a plot, but a confession. Not of guilt, but of knowledge. There's more. In the handwritten manuscript, a character named Margaret refers to a place called the Observatory. No such location appears in any of Christie's published works, but there was an estate in Oxfordshire, just 5 miles north of the greenhouse site, known locally as the Observatory. It was demolished in 1952 after a fire. What caused the fire was never confirmed, but there's a rumor that a portion of the home had been sealed off, boarded, avoided, due to a room no one used, where a woman once waited, wearing a brooch with a broken wing. We're not saying Agatha Christie committed any crime. We are not saying she covered anything up. We are only asking the questions her manuscript insists we consider. Why do these details match? Why did she hide them? And what truth kept returning to her, quietly, as the clock ticked and the memories refused to fade? Are you watching closely? Because this is how the manuscript works. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you echoes, repeated images, unfinished lines, a brooch, a greenhouse, initials left in margins like breadcrumbs. And in the center of it all, Miss Marple, the quiet observer, the woman who notices everything, the woman who, in this unpublished story, doesn't solve anything. She only watches and writes it all down. even when no one believes her. There's a saying in her published stories: Miss Marple never forgets what doesn't fit. But in this one, she remembers something that was never supposed to be part of the puzzle at all, because it wasn't a puzzle. It was a memory. And memories don't fade when you lock them in the attic. They wait, and when the door creaks open, even just a little, they step back into the light. Chapter 4, the 1947 case file. Some cases are written with ink. Others are carved into silence. It's not always the loudest stories that stay. Sometimes it's the ones whispered in between, barely remembered, almost forgotten, that reach back out and ask to be heard again. This is one of them. An untitled file, cataloged by hand, Box 14B, filed under Unexplained. Inside, a faded envelope, a sketch of a room, a report with more redacted lines and words. And the photograph. She wasn't named, not officially, not then, but someone somewhere gave her one. The woman at the inn. January 19th, 47. A storm hit the southern countryside of England, cold enough to keep the roads silent for 3 days. The villages along the coast were locked under ice. And yet, through that frost, the hearth of the modest countryside and kept its embers going. The bell and birch, old stone, 3 rooms, fireplace that had seen 3 wars, 100 winters. And on the morning of January 12th, the innkeeper's daughter came downstairs to prepare breakfast. She walked past the empty parlor, but one chair was turned, slightly angled toward the fire. In it, a woman, still, eyes closed. At first, she thought nothing of it. Guests occasionally rose early to enjoy the quiet, but she didn't move. And when the girl stepped closer, she knew something was wrong. There were no signs of struggle, no marks, no notes, no purse, only her coat neatly folded at her side, and a hairpin shaped like a leaf resting in her lap. The police were called. Photographs were taken, footprints logged, but something stood out. She had checked in under no name, paid in cash, no record, no luggage. She had arrived after dusk, requested no meal, and asked only for a room facing the garden. The innkeeper remembered her voice. Soft, precise, not local. She said only 3 words when she checked in. One night only. There was no identification on her, no ring, no address in the pocket, just a folded page from a book, pressed into her coat lining. On that page, a passage was underlined. From The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie. It read, "A life is made up of a great number of small incidents, and a small number of great ones." She had underlined the second part, a small number of great ones. The report did not determine cause. There was no evidence of harm, only a strange stillness. The coroner's summary was brief. Suspended observation, no immediate signs of trauma, awaiting further instruction. That instruction never came. There was no family to contact, no name to print, and with no answers, no investigation followed. Just a quiet closing of the file. Stamped, filed, forgotten. Until now, could Miss Marple have solved this real case? Could her sharp eyes, her methodical mind, have spotted what the authorities missed? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because what comes next may shift everything you think you know. Let's return to the scene. The chair was wooden, elm, placed precisely in front of the fire. The woman's hands were gloved, odd, given how warm the room had been. And beneath her right glove, found only after careful examination, a scar. Thin, delicate, stray across the wrist, as though from a childhood injury or a forgotten accident. It was not listed in the file as relevant, but it was noted once, in faint pencil on the corner of the page. Old mark, not new, not self-made. The autopsy, such as it was, revealed no poison, no foreign substances, no trauma, just a body at rest, and a question unanswered. Who was she? Why had she come to this inn? And what happened the night before that no one heard, no one saw, and no one could explain? Some believe she was a war widow, displaced, looking for peace in a land that no longer remembered her name. Others believe she was never meant to be found, that the bell and birch wasn't her destination, but her delay, an interruption, something unexpected. But there's another theory, not official, not verified, but passed from one archivist to the next in whispers, that she had been there for a reason, not to rest, not to flee, but to wait for someone or for something. A map was discovered days later, tucked beneath the inn's guest ledger. Not modern, not detailed, just a sketch. The surrounding village. One road traced in ink, a circle drawn in the forest, and 2 words beside it, where it ends. No one connected it at the time, but that phrase appears in the unpublished manuscript found decades later. On the final page, the line reads, "She sat beside the fire, waiting for the last sound to pass," because that's always where it ends. It's not clear who wrote that line. Christie's own handwriting begins to falter toward the final pages. There are edits, overwrites, whole sections that seem almost dreamlike, blurred in their logic. But the presence is there. The atmosphere matches the inn, the chair, the fire, the woman. Not a direct description, but an echo, like someone trying to remember a moment without admitting they'd seen it, because that's always where it ends. This is where the question takes shape. What if the manuscript wasn't fiction? What if it was a reflection, distorted, refined, but born from something real? And what if that scene, that moment in front of the fire, wasn't just imagined? What if it was witnessed? What would you do if you wrote something because you couldn't say it out loud? If you shaped a story to release something you couldn't explain? Would anyone believe it? Or would they call it coincidence? Here's what makes this case harder to forget. The page from the moving finger. The one found folded in her coat. That same page was later found to be missing from a rare first edition copy in Agatha Christie's private library. It was never replaced. The tear mark matched precisely. That copy was in storage at the time of the woman's discovery. Only 3 people had access to it. Agatha, her assistant, and a third person whose name has been lost to incomplete records. We've tried to trace it, but there are gaps, names blacked out, a signature that was scrubbed clean from the checkout log. Intentionally? We cannot say, but the absence once again speaks, as though someone wanted to erase the connection before it could be drawn. The woman at the inn was never claimed. Her body was buried under a temporary marker. No inscription, just a date. The weather that day was cold, bone deep, the kind of cold that lingers. She rests now in an unmarked plot just outside the village where the bell and birch once stood. The inn itself burned down in 1959. Electrical fault, they said, but the ledger survived. And on that ledger, one final line, written in a different hand, not dated, not signed, just a sentence, scrawled across the bottom margin. She never got to say it. What didn't she say? What did she come to do? And why did someone go so far to ensure her story was never told? Fiction gives us answers. It satisfies. But reality doesn't care about answers. It just leaves threads, worn, frayed, and waiting for someone to notice them again. This is one of those threads. And if the manuscript is any clue, someone already pulled it and never let go. Chapter 5, Marple or Murderer. There's a moment in every great story where the lines begin to blur, where the question changes, not for what happened, but who wrote it down and why. That moment doesn't arrive with fanfare. It's quiet, soft-footed, and by the time you notice it, you're already too far in to step away. This chapter is about that moment, about a woman who saw the world through a teacup rim and lace curtain, and another who watched the world forget what it was never meant to remember. They might be the same woman, or they might not. In 1927, a woman named Miss Jane Marple appeared on the literary scene. Mild, observant, polite, unassuming in every way. She gardened, she knitted, she noticed things no one else bothered to question. And over the next 4 decades, she would quietly walk through parlors and crime scenes alike, solving what the authorities could not. Readers adored her, feared her in quiet ways. because beneath the sherry and soft voice, there was something else, an awareness, a stillness, as though she had seen more than she said and knew more than she wrote. But here's the thing about Marple. She wasn't just a character. To some, she was a cipher. To others, the mirror. And to a few who spent years studying Agatha Christie's most private pages, she may have been something far more complex. Not a creation, but a confession. Let me explain. There is a theory, not popular, not endorsed, but persistent, that Agatha Christie didn't invent Miss Marple in the way we think, that she didn't so much create her as recorder, that the character was not fictional, but an echo, a vessel, a shadow self created to tell truths through the lens of polite narrative. After all, Jane Marple never married. She never had children. She lived alone in a quiet village and wrote letters that no one else ever read. And Agatha, she did marry. She had a daughter. But for all her global fame, she never seemed to speak much of herself. Not deeply, not publicly. She preferred to let her fiction do the talking. And in that fiction, Miss Marple's voice always sounded the clearest. Researchers have combed through thousands of Christie's personal notes, manuscripts, and letters. One of them, tucked into the back of a gardening calendar from 1961, contains a strange little paragraph, unpublished, undated. It reads, "Marple isn't clever. She's tired of watching. But she cannot look away, because to look away would mean forgetting, and forgetting is a crime far worse than remembering." Who was she referring to? A character? A part of herself? Or someone she once knew? Do you believe characters come from imagination alone? Or can they come from memory, buried under fiction and polished into story? Is Marple a detective or a witness? Is she watching strangers or reliving scenes too real to claim as her own? Let's return to the unpublished manuscript we've been unraveling. It is, by all standards, strange, unstructured, fragmented, filled with contradictions. In one scene, Marple appears to walk into a village she's lived in for 30 years and doesn't recognize anyone. She refers to people by the wrong names, mentions stores that haven't existed since the war, describes a bakery that burned down in 1943. But these aren't mistakes, because in the margin, Christie wrote this note. She remembers the version that came before forgetting, not a correction, not an edit, a confirmation. There's more. In the same manuscript, a passage describes a garden, familiar to readers, a common scene in Christie's work. But this garden is different. The hedges are described as half-pruned, as though someone got halfway through and remembered something better left alone. The sunflowers don't face the light, and Miss Marple stands there, holding a book, not reading, not writing, just holding it, as though waiting for someone to notice what's written inside. The title of that book? Never revealed. But in the notes, there's a scrawled phrase. Truth can be rewritten, but guilt never sleeps. Not in character, not dialogue, just floating in the margins. So what guilt was never sleeping? Whose? And why put it there? There's a photograph, rare, uncirculated, of Christie sitting on a bench in her garden. She's holding a pen, looking straight at the camera, not smiling, not posing, just waiting. The photograph's original print had something faint in the lower corner, scratched into the emulsion. It said, "I'm still listening." The scratch was removed in later reproductions. Some believed it was a defect. Others weren't so sure, because Jane Marple always listened. And so did Agatha, to stories, to silences, to the truths that no one was allowed to say. Is it possible Miss Marple knew something her readers didn't? That her quiet demeanor masked a deeper truth? That the way she observed the world wasn't just for story's sake? Could she have been watching because her creator was? Could Agatha Christie have placed herself in the pages, not to share, but to warn? In the final draft of the manuscript, never printed, never seen until now, there's a monologue, a rare thing for Christie. Marple speaks to a man who isn't named, and she says, "People think I solve things, that I connect the clues and find what others miss. But I don't. I simply remember what others pretend to forget. What did she remember? What did Agatha want remembered? And who was pretending? This is not to accuse. This is not to cast judgment. This is to ask what we've been circling since the first page. Was Jane Marple Agatha's disguise or her testimony? There's a note found on the back of a check stub, folded in a first edition of Nemesis. It simply reads, "I could only tell the truth once. The rest had to be wrapped in fiction." We don't know when it was written. We don't know what truth it refers to. But we do know this. Miss Marple always appeared where something needed uncovering. Not because she sought the mystery, but because the mystery always came to her. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps she was placed in those villages and parlors not to solve crimes, but to tell someone else's story, through the safety of fiction, through the veil of a character who could say things Agatha never could. What if Miss Marple wasn't just a tool? What if she was a message? And what if we've been reading it all wrong? In the end, perhaps the most revealing moment isn't what was written, but what was erased. In the final pages of the unpublished manuscript, there is a section blacked out with thick, hurried strokes. Beneath it, faintly and only visible under a microscope, 3 words survive, almost indecipherable, but not entirely. They read, "She warned them all." Who was she? What was the warning? And who ignored it? We may never know. But if Miss Marple wasn't a mask, then she was a message. And messages have a way of returning when we least expect them. Chapter 6, Red Herrings and Real Danger. There's a particular kind of mystery that doesn't want to be solved. It opens its doors to the curious, lays out a few clues, points to a few suspects, and then waits because some puzzles aren't broken. They're built that way, deliberately misaligned. A test not of logic, but of memory. This chapter walks into that room, not to solve, but to see what's been left behind, and what's been kept hidden right in front of us. In 1947, a woman was found seated in a quiet room at a country inn, unidentified, alone, no explanation offered, no motive ever confirmed. A quiet case, filed away, but if you pull at the corners of that report, something else emerges. Not a full confession, but shapes. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 people who passed through the edges of that forgotten night, each with something they didn't say, and all of them standing close enough to touch the truth. Let's begin with the first. Suspect 1, the groundskeeper. His name was Arthur Pritchard, a man known around the village for his silence, his stiff posture, and the collection of pocket watches he wore without winding. Arthur tended the bell and birch garden in 1947. By all accounts, he lived alone, kept to the edges of things. He said little to the guests, but records show that Arthur had worked the garden for over 15 years. And yet, when asked to describe the woman found that January morning, he said something that didn't make sense. She never came through the garden. That much I know. I'd have heard her, except the back door to the inn led straight to the hedge path. It was the only route to the main room where she was discovered, which means if she was there, Arthur had to have seen her. And if he didn't, then she came another way, or someone else opened the door for her. Arthur was never charged, never even held, but one detail lingers. A letter discovered among his personal items after his passing in 1963. Unsent, addressed only to her. The final line read, "I saw her before the light went out. I told myself it didn't matter, but it never left me." The handwriting was Arthur's, but the envelope was sealed with the same wax used by the bell and birch. Suspect 2, the visitor, Margaret Lee, a journalist from London, known for her theater reviews and a column titled Whispers from the Isle. Margaret had traveled through Oxfordshire during the first week of January, allegedly en route to interview a playwright in Devon, but she never arrived. Instead, she checked into the Bell and Birch, under a different name. Records from the local constable's notebook, scribbled hastily, list a Marjorie Lamb, staying one night, paying in notes. That name does not appear in Margaret's known aliases, nor did she mention the detour in any of her scheduled dispatches. But this is where it becomes peculiar. Margaret's own notes, retrieved from a satchel she left in a London cafe, contain a short paragraph describing a woman in a garden. Not just any garden, a frost-covered greenhouse, with a single chair turned away from the door. The same greenhouse mentioned in the unpublished manuscript. The same setting as the cold case. Coincidence or observation? No one knows why Margaret was at the inn. No one knows why she used a different name. But in the margins of her journal, a small notation was found beside the sketch of the greenhouse. It reads, "She told me not to tell, but she didn't say why." The she was never identified. The note was never published. And Margaret refused interviews on the matter for the rest of her life. And now the third, suspect 3, the widow, her name, publicly, was Eleanor Winchell, but locally, she was simply known as Mrs. W., a quiet woman, wealthy, reclusive, lived just 3 miles from the Bell and Birch. She was known to take long walks at dusk, dressed always in black, even before her husband passed away. Her estate bordered the woods where the greenhouse once stood. No visitors, no parties, no mail, just a woman, alone, and a house filled with locked doors. Local children said she talked to herself. Others said she wrote letters that she never mailed. But one of those letters, found in a second-hand book donated to a local church, contained something unexpected. Not a confession, not a name, but a single paragraph, written in nearly identical cadence to the unpublished manuscript. The paragraph reads, "She stood beside the window for hours, watching path. She knew someone would return, and she was ready to listen, even if they never spoke." What was Eleanor waiting for? Who did she expect to return? And why did her writing match the cadence of someone she never claimed to know? Because, and this is important, Eleanor Winchell and Agatha Christie were never seen in the same place. Their circles never intersected. No letters, no photographs, no interviews. And yet, in the margins of Eleanor's note, the initials AC were scratched lightly. Twice, no explanation, just the letters. And a symbol, a small moth with one wing. Are these suspects or shadows? Are we looking at people who knew something? Or people who were part of something? Could one of them have opened the door that night? Could one of them have spoken the wrong truth to the right person? Could one of them have heard the final line before the scene was set? Or are they part of a red herring crafted by a master storyteller? Because that's what makes this more difficult when a writer is as gifted as Agatha Christie. Even the misdirection feels like revelation, and the false trails sometimes are the most honest. In the unpublished manuscript, one character stands out, a woman named Harriet Wilford. She is not a detective, not a suspect, just present. She walks the same road 3 times. She stops at the garden gate, each time pausing. And on the final page, she places a brooch on a windowsill. The narrator says only. She never claimed the truth. She only protected the pieces. Many believe Harriet Wilford was modeled after someone real. And her mannerisms? They match Eleanor Winchell's known habits. Same scarf, same walking path, same tendency to linger outside rather than knock. So then we ask, was Harriet fiction or a carefully rewritten reality? And if so, why bury her in the story? Why not name her? Unless, of course, doing so would mean something had to be acknowledged. Something that couldn't be said in daylight. Red herrings are meant to distract, to keep the eyes moving, to shift the mind away from what it nearly understands. But sometimes, the red herrings are more than distraction. Sometimes they're protection, because the real danger isn't always what's in the center. It's what surrounds it, what stands nearby, what stays silent when everything else speaks. Arthur, Margaret, Eleanor, 3 names, 3 shadows, all near the scene, none with alibis, and one of them mirrored on the page of a manuscript no one was ever meant to read. If the truth lies somewhere between them, then the question isn't just who knew something, it's who needed it forgotten, and why. Chapter 7, The Unnamed Woman. There's always someone who slips through. In every story, in every record, in every room full of facts and faded ink. There's one figure who resists identification, not because she isn't real, but because someone made sure the name never stuck. In this case, we know her only as M, a letter, not a title, not an abbreviation, just M. She appears 3 times in the unpublished manuscript, never introduced, never explained, only described in brief moments, each more curious than the last. Moments that feel like they belong to someone real, not invented, not constructed, witnessed, remembered, and then rewritten. The first mention of M is fleeting. The narrator, unusually distant in this section, simply states, M arrived without a coat, though the air bit through the hedges like regret. She wore her silence like perfume, strong and clinging. It's not a description typical of Christie. It's colder, less crafted, more like something recalled in haste, jotted down so the memory wouldn't fade before morning. This M does not speak. She stands near the gate. She watches the windows. And then she's gone. No dialogue, no reveal, just a sense of something left unsaid. But it's the second appearance that begins to raise questions. M never asked for a room. She asked for a mirror, just one, and when she looked into it, she did not flinch. What kind of woman asked for a mirror? What does that mean in the language of fiction? Is it symbolism? Or a detail only someone who saw her would remember? And if Christie never meant for the story to be published, why include such a line at all? Unless it wasn't for the reader, unless it was for her. Do you remember someone because they mattered? Or because they were never supposed to? What kind of presence leaves behind only impressions, no words, no name, no trace, just a silence shaped like a person? Who was M? And why was she written into the margins of a manuscript never meant for the light? Let's step back, because here's where fiction and reality start to reflect each other again. In 1947, the same year as the cold case, a journalist named Mara Ellingham vanished from the press circuit. Her name was known among the post-war reporting scene, a woman who walked through train stations and hotel corridors with a sharp hat and sharper pencil. She reported from towns no one remembered. She wrote stories that felt like warnings, and she made enemies without meaning to, or maybe she meant to. That part we'll never know. What we do know is this. Mara's final piece was sent from Oxfordshire, the same county as the Bell and Birch Inn. Same month, same week. The article never ran. The editor claimed to arrive blank, an envelope filled with nothing but empty pages and a single quote torn from a notebook. That quote, people will believe what's printed. They won't believe what's whispered. No one ever found Mara's full notes. No one ever confirmed what the article was about, only that it was her last. When Christie's manuscript was later uncovered and the character of M was analyzed, some researchers noted uncanny similarities between the two women, not just in mannerisms, but in moments. For instance, M is described as knowing the layout of a village she claims never to have visited. In a moment, the narrator seems unsure how to frame. It reads, she walked as though retracing steps not her own, as though the memory had been borrowed or forced. This echoes something Mara once wrote in a letter to a friend, one of the last she ever sent. In it, she said, I've started having a strange feeling that I've been places I've never been, that I'm remembering someone else's story. Not fiction. A letter, dated 1 week before she vanished. Coincidence? Maybe, but the pattern tightens. Because the third and final mention of M in the manuscript is also the last line of the chapter. She wasn't a story. She was what the story forgot to erase. What does that mean? Is M a ghost? A warning? A person whose truth was left behind while others told her story for her? We don't know, but let's return to Mara one more time. Her room, rented at a small inn along the road, was found empty, clean, unremarkable, but behind the mirror, tucked into the wall panel, they found a piece of paper, folded twice. No writing on the front. On the inside, scrawled in blue ink, tell Jane she was right. Who's Jane? Was it a friend? A colleague? Or was it a reference? To Jane Marple? To someone watching from fiction, mirroring someone real? What happens when reality imitates fiction and fiction reflects back? What if M wasn't character? What if she was a memory? A presence that slipped between the lines because the lines weren't solid. They were porous, like windows left open in a storm. And what came through was never meant to be written down. Let me show you something else. There's an audio recording, one of only a few ever taken of Christie during a private interview. The journalist, a man with a calm voice, asks her, "Do your characters ever surprise you?" She responds, "Some do. One in particular, I didn't write so much as remember." He asks who. She smiles. Then the tape cuts. No name given, but the reel is marked with a single letter. M. There's a reason M was never fully written, a reason she never speaks. Because sometimes characters aren't given voices because their voice was already taken from them, and all that remains is the echo, the soft steps in an empty corridor, the scent of perfume no one admits to wearing, the shape in a mirror that blinks after you've walked away. M is the unnamed woman, the story forgot, and whether she was Mara or someone else entirely, she was remembered in margins, in edits, in empty chairs near windows no longer open, and in one final note found at the end of the unpublished manuscript, written in ink so faint it can only be seen under angled light. The note reads, she didn't need a name. She just needed to be remembered by someone who wasn't afraid. So here's the question for you. Would you name her? Would you write her in? Would you believe her story if it had no beginning, no middle, just an ending you were never supposed to find? Because M, whoever she was, wasn't a mystery. She was a memory. And memories, when silenced too long, start to find their way back. One letter at a time. Chapter 8, Loss in Translation. Not every sentence means what it says. Some speak plainly. Some conceal meaning between words. And some are not written to be read at all. They are codes, veils stitched from language, memory, and the instinct to protect what shouldn't be revealed too easily. In this chapter, we turn our attention not to what was written, but to what was hidden, inside the manuscript, inside the edits, and inside the space between letters. It started with a misplaced symbol. A researcher, deep in the archives of the Christie estate, noticed something peculiar. A paragraph, 3/4 down page 73. The sentence reads, "She walked to the edge of the clearing and turned her face toward the orchard, where the light touched the stone at exactly 4:17. The phrase seemed harmless, until he noticed at the time, 4:17, was repeated again 4 pages later. Then again in a completely unrelated chapter, each time without explanation, and each time followed by a name, but not a name of a character, a name of a place. Places that on their own meant little, but when mapped, they formed something else entirely. A shape, a path, a triangle across 3 points, stretching from Oxfordshire to Torquay to a forest in Devon. Coordinates, but not presented plainly. Encoded, buried, waiting. The process of decoding the full set of coordinates took weeks. The archivist, known publicly only as E, realized that Christie had embedded her clues using a method not uncommon in wartime communication, an old-fashioned cipher, letters replaced with sequences, punctuation as directional shifts, capital letters guiding the placement. It was not complex, but it was deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken the time to ensure these references wouldn't jump off the page. They'd need to be earned, which raises a question. Why hide locations? Why plant them in a manuscript that was never submitted, never acknowledged, never discussed? Unless they weren't meant for the public. Unless the manuscript wasn't a draft, but a message. If you stumbled across coordinates buried in fiction, would you follow them? Would you go to the place that someone, decades earlier, did everything they could encode? Would you risk what you might find? Because someone did. A local cartographer named Alistair Rains, an explorer of forgotten places, collector of lost stories, and, for lack of a better title, a seeker. He took the coordinates, mapped them, and found himself at the edge of Dartmoor. Not the wild, expose her the more, but its quieter perimeter, a place where the trees gather tight and the light has to ask permission to pass through. There, beyond a fallen wall and beneath an ivy-covered archway, he found it, or what remained of it, a stone structure. One room, half swallowed by the forest, inside dust, ash, and what looked like the skeletal frame of a fireplace, long and used. At first, nothing remarkable, until he looked closer. Near the hearth, charred, curled, and partially consumed, were 3 pages. Pages that survived fire not by chance, but by being pressed beneath a rusted metal grate, not fully burned, not fully intact, legible only in fragments, but unmistakably familiar. Handwriting, margin notes, and a signature. A.C. Agatha Christie. The pages matched no known manuscript. They weren't part of the unpublished work we've been exploring, but the style? Identical. Even the ink had aged the same. What were these pages? Why were they there? And who tried to destroy them? The contents of the pages were eventually restored in part, using thermal recovery techniques and ultraviolet scanning. What emerged was chilling, not in its description, not in its tone, but in its message. One line stood out among the rest, still scorched along the edges, but intact. It read, "Some stories were never meant to be read." Why would someone write that? Why commit words to paper, only to erase them with fire, unless the act of writing was never about the telling, but about the remembering? The confession not meant to be heard, only released, like exhaling something that had waited too long to leave the lungs. What kind of story must be written in secret, buried beneath fiction and then set alight? What truth was too much? What memory too fragile? Who were these coordinates meant for? A reader? A friend? Or someone Christie hoped would find it long after she was gone? And if so, what were they meant to see? Because here's the part no one can fully explain. The fireplace was warm, not hot, but recently disturbed. Ashes soft, air still faintly scented with paper and ink, which means someone had been there not long before Alistair arrived. Someone tried again to finish what they started, to erase the last pieces. But something always survives. A sentence, a line, a symbol, a place that was never meant to be found. Soft ambient return, radio static, faint echo of a voice trying to come through. In one of the half-burned paragraphs, a woman is described standing before a fire, holding a box. Not large, not ornate, just wooden. She whispers a name. The name is smudged, lost in flame. But the box is placed in the hearth, not thrown, set gently, and before the passage ends, the narrator writes, "It was not the burning that mattered. It was a moment before." That line doesn't appear anywhere else. It exists only in the burned pages, which means Christie either removed it intentionally from the manuscript or never intended it to be read at all. Alistair took photos of the site, returned the pages to climate-controlled storage, and wrote a single sentence in his field journal. It read, "She wasn't warning us about a story. She was protecting us from the one that never made it to print." What was that story? We can't say. Not yet, but we know this. The coordinates point to a place. The place holds a fire. And the fire tried and failed to erase something more than fiction. So where does that leave us? With pieces, half-truths, a trail of breadcrumbs leading through decades of silence, and at the center of it, a manuscript encoded with names, times, and places that intersect with real lives, real losses, and real places where someone once stood. Perhaps this wasn't a novel. Perhaps it was a memory map, a quiet archive of everything too dangerous to say in her own name. And so she said it as someone else, under initials, in side clues, between the lines. And when it grew too heavy, she lit the match. But the ash still speaks. What if the stories we read weren't meant to entertain? What if some were meant to shield? What if the story hidden in the fire was never for us to read? And yet, here we are, reading it anyway. Chapter 9, The Fireplace Discovery. Not all discoveries begin with clarity. Some start as fragments. charred corners of forgotten stories, words that resist returning to full form. But in those fragments, when pieced together carefully, deliberately, something begins to take shape. A shape that suggests there was always more to the story, and that someone never meant it to be found. Until now, we left off with a fireplace, deep in the wooded edges of Devon, a hearth long abandoned, the structure collapsing into itself, almost ashamed to still stand. There, 3 partially burned pages were recovered, pages that matched Agatha Christie's handwriting, but did not match any of her known works. They were neither draft nor revision. They were something else, something final, not just in tone, but in structure, a conclusion, the end of a story that, until then, no one knew had begun. And yet, this final chapter never made it to shelves, never passed through editors, never surfaced in letters or libraries. It was only ever found in fire, which raises one central question. Why would someone hide an ending? The pages were damaged, yes, blackened, edges curled, much of the ink lost, but what remained was enough. Enough to tell us that this was not a fictional resolution. This was not Hercule Poirot offering polite deduction over coffee, not Miss Marple politely suggesting to Vicar, look again at the garden gate. This was colder, more precise, and deeply personal. It begins like this. She stood with her back to the fire, not because she feared the cold, but because she feared what the light might show. No character is named, no location offered, just a single woman facing inward, listening, and a second presence, referred only as the other. No description, no dialogue, just implication that this other person held something, not an object, a truth, one the woman did not want spoken aloud, a confrontation, but not the loud kind. This confrontation is a conversation, one that twists gently, like 2 people speaking in polite code while meaning something else entirely. At one point, the line reads, the other said, you wrote it as fiction, but we both know fiction doesn't come knocking on your door in the middle of winter. There's a pause after that line, a break in the paragraph, as though even the author needed a breath before continuing. Then it resumes. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The fire was already warm and the truth already spoken. We don't know what that truth was, but we know it wasn't written down. Instead, what follows is a description of movement, a chair scraped across stone, a clock that stopped ticking, and a sentence that no one can explain. He left nothing behind, but the scent of camphor never faded. No body, no evidence, only a room that no longer holds what it once contained. This is where interpretation begins, because this isn't just storytelling. This is encoding. This is memory filtered through metaphor. And in that memory, we find an ending that didn't resolve the plot, but closed the door, one that someone wanted sealed for good. What happens when the end of a story is not a conclusion, but a concealment? Not a final act, but an erasure? And if this confrontation wasn't imagined, then who was the other? And what was taken with them, unspoken, across the threshold? There's something else. On the final of the 3 recovered pages, nearly illegible at first, a signature, scorched through the middle, but partially intact. 3 letters, clear as ink, AC, no flourish, no page number, just the initials, scrawled below what appears to be a line struck from the page. A sentence never meant to be read. It's been restored as much as possible. It reads, you told me it would never catch up to us. But here we are, back where it started, and the fire still remembers. Who is you? Who is us? And what exactly did the fire remember? Because according to Christie's known timeline, there was no such story, no such scene, no such confrontation. But now we have its ending, and it leads backward, not forward, through false names, erased places, empty chairs, and characters whose existence slips between shadow and structure. This final chapter is not about resolution. It's about reflection, what was done, what was never spoken, and what lingers in the scent of scorched ink. Even after the page is gone, there's another detail, barely noticed at first. A faint watermark, visible only under specific light. It wasn't discovered until the pages were being restored. The watermark forms an address. Partial, incomplete, but enough to trace the location. A cottage near the River Dart, a place no longer standing. Collapsed in 1955 due to foundation rot, but was known briefly as the Quiet House. No one knows who gave it that name, but locals said it was used occasionally, rented by writers, artists, or those seeking seclusion. Agatha Christie was known to retreat to the Devon countryside, but there is no official record of her visiting that particular property. And yet, her initials appear on a page that references its floor plan. Even the description of the fireplace matches the exact dimensions cataloged in land registry photographs. So the question deepens. Was this final chapter an invention? Or was it a memory? Do you believe a writer can exorcise truth through fiction? That stories can hold real things, real events, real regrets, without ever naming them? That confrontation doesn't need bodies or blood to feel real, because this ending feels remembered, written not from imagination, but from something witnessed, something endured, and then tucked away beneath ash. Here's what we're left with. A confrontation described only in gesture, a scent that lingers where presence has fled, and a signature confirming that someone knew exactly what they were saying, even as they tried to burn it. But the fire didn't consume it all. And now, we hold what they tried to let go of. And we must ask, why end the story this way? What truth was she speaking to? And who was listening? There's a final note, one that appeared not on the page, but scribbled in pencil along the inside cover of the recovered manuscript box. Barely visible, almost lost in dust. It reads, "Don't rewrite this. Let the silence speak. That's where the truth is." We've reconstructed the pages. We've followed the coordinates. We've listened to the silences. And now we're left with this. An ending that doesn't explain. It warns. And perhaps that was the point. Chapter 10. Fact, fiction, or foreshadowing. By now, the pages are laid out, the codes uncovered, the coordinates mapped, the fire searched, the confrontation, if it happened at all, chronicled in fragments written by a hand the world had come to trust. But even now, after all of that, we remain in a fog, not of memory, not of truth, but of intent. What was the manuscript? What did Agatha Christie mean by it? Was it a final puzzle left for the reader, a fiction embedded with meaning? Or was it something else? A confession? A safeguard? Or perhaps a warning? In this chapter, we turn not to the characters, not to the events, but to the scholars, the readers of readers, the keepers of the literary maps, because they too have seen it. The manuscript, the margins, the inconsistencies, the gaps, and in their silence, you can hear the weight of something not quite explainable. I've read every word Agatha ever published, says Dr. Margaret Elson, professor of literary hermeneutics at Oxford. But this is different. This isn't her voice refined through fiction. It's something rawer, like she's writing for someone else, not a reader, a witness. Elson, who has published 3 volumes on Christie's narrative structures, admits she hesitated before discussing the manuscript publicly, because to speak of it, she says, is to risk misunderstanding her, or worse, understanding her all too well. Then there's Lionel Hargrove. He specializes in code breaking as literary form, hidden patterns, symbolic logic, metaphorical encryption. He believes a manuscript was constructed deliberately, not as a story, but as a signal. Look at the way she frames the scenes, he explains. No resolution, no climax. Characters appear and vanish without function, unless you treat them as markers. To Hargrove, the manuscript doesn't follow narrative logic. It follows cartographic logic. He says, the names aren't names. The places aren't settings. They're coordinates in a different language, emotional language, the way memory encodes trauma. But others aren't so convinced. Dr. Alice Northam, who curated the Christie Centennial exhibit in 1990, warns against literary projection. It's easy, she says, To turn fiction into autobiography when the fiction refuses to explain itself. To her, the manuscript is experimental, a writing exercise, a philosophical draft. Christie knew the shape of narrative better than anyone. What you're seeing, she insists, is a writer breaking form for her own intellectual pleasure. And yet, even she can't explain certain things. Like the note on page 108, the one that reads, "I never wrote this for them. I wrote this for the one who already knows." Who is the one? Among the literary community, debates grow sharper in the margins. Each page of the manuscript offering contradiction, every clue leading to more questions. One historian believes it's an encoded memoir. Another, a hidden manuscript meant to be found only if someone proved worthy. Another still, a carefully constructed mirror for the reader, meant not to tell a story, but to test their reaction, to see who notices what, and who doesn't. Was this fiction predicting a real crime, a map to something that was already done? Or was it her way of exhaling truth through a form no one would question? Let us know what you believe. But listen to this first, because there's one detail that hasn't been discussed. Not publicly, not widely, not until now. In a file kept by Christie's long-retired typist, who passed away in 1996, was a letter, stamped but never sent, unsealed, dated 1954. The letter was addressed to a Miss L.W., no full name, but the content is unmistakable. A single paragraph, written in Christie's hand, that reads, "You asked if I would ever write the truth. I have, but it is coded and left out of sequence. If anyone ever understands it, they already carry part of the burden, and if not, no harm done." This wasn't poetic language. This wasn't metaphor. This was confession as encryption, not because the truth was dangerous, but because the truth may have already been forgotten by everyone but her. What was the burden she referred to? What was the truth she chose not to say plainly? Theories, of course, abound. Some believe the manuscript alludes to a wartime intelligence operation, that Christie knew things via acquaintances or confidential work that were never meant to be spoken. Others point to an incident in 1926, when Christie herself disappeared for 11 days. No full explanation was ever given. Could the manuscript be tied to that missing time? A patch of memory she was never allowed to explain. So she turned it into something else? Something coded, something fictional, something safe. Whatever the answer is, the scholars, the archivists, the readers all agree on one point. This wasn't meant to be read casually. It wasn't meant for mass publication. It was a message dressed as narrative, and those who read it closely begin to feel as if it's reading them in return. There's a note scrawled at the very bottom of the final page. Faint, ink almost vanished. It reads, "You will know the moment. It will feel like memory, but it won't be yours." And maybe that's what this is. Not a confession, not a warning, but a transfer of memory, of meaning, of something Agatha Christie couldn't carry anymore. So she broke into fiction, scattered the pieces, and left just enough thread for someone else to stitch it together. Someone who wasn't afraid of silence. Someone who could tell the difference between a puzzle and a plea. What do you think this was? A final story? A hidden truth? A cry through fiction? Let us know, because the last few pages suggest something else entirely, and what they reveal may not be a conclusion at all, but a beginning, one she never got to write. Chapter 11, The Night of the Disappearance. Every mystery has a beginning, but some choose not to announce it. They prefer to unfold quietly beneath familiar places, to disguise themselves as ordinary events, easily dismissed, gently forgotten. And then, years later, someone reads the same story again, and suddenly realizes the beginning wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't the first page. It was a warning no one noticed. Until now, December 3rd, 1926. Agatha Christie, already a household name, left her home in Berkshire. She was 36 years old, famous, married, and, by most accounts, stable. But that evening, she packed a small bag, stepped into her Morris Cowley roadster, and disappeared. The car was found the next morning, abandoned near a chalk quarry. Engine off, headlights still glowing faintly into fog. Inside, her coat, a driving license, and an expired train ticket. No note, no clue, no sign of struggle, no explanation. For 11 days, she was gone. Newspapers speculated wildly. Suicide, memory loss, a publicity stunt. Others pointed fingers at her husband, Archibald Christie, who had recently confessed to an affair. He denied knowing where she'd gone. Friends remained silent. Scotland Yard grew frustrated. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, attempted to use a psychic to find her. It didn't work. Nothing did, not until day 11, when she was discovered, mildly disoriented, staying at a hotel under an assumed name. She had registered as Mrs. Teresa Neal. The surname matched that of her husband's mistress. When asked why she left, she gave no clear answer. She would never explain it, not in interviews, not in journals, not in fiction, except perhaps once. Buried deep in the unpublished manuscript we've been unraveling is a timeline. It isn't labeled, not openly, but its sequence, its references, mirror something eerily familiar. A woman boards a train. She arrives in a countryside village. She walks into an inn and registers under a false name. She claims to be from South Africa. She says she's a widow. She orders dinner for one, and she asks the staff not to disturb her room. Sound familiar? It should, because those were the exact steps Agatha Christie took in 1926. Nearly identical in tone and gesture, the fictional account hidden in the unpublished manuscript matches the real-life disappearance, almost hour by hour. What does that mean? Some believe the manuscript was her attempt to fictionalize the event she couldn't speak of, to rewrite the night she vanished, to claim ownership of memory that had fractured under pressure. Others believe something else, that the manuscript wasn't fiction, but a rehearsal, a test, a private performance of an escape plan that had been imagined long before it was enacted. Do you believe in memory without narrative? In events that happen, but are never fully processed? Do you believe someone can disappear not to run, but to observe? To see what the world does when they are no longer present, and what it says about the world when it doesn't look hard enough to find them? Because the manuscript doesn't just reflect the disappearance. It echoes its quiet. It mimics the hush. It tells a story where a woman vanishes, not in panic, but in peace. Like she needed the silence more than she needed the solution. Page 91 of the manuscript holds the key. A paragraph with no character names. No dialogue. Just this. Sometimes the only way to be seen is to become missing. Sometimes the story won't allow you to be the narrator, so you erase yourself. And wait. This was not a line crafted for drama. This was personal. This was written by someone who knew what it meant to vanish, on purpose, and perhaps what it meant to return because the world expected her to, but not because she wanted to. During her stay at the Swan Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, she wore elegant clothes, a serene demeanor. She danced, read newspapers, joined other guests for dinner, and all the while, never admitted who she was until someone recognized her face in the papers. 11 days. In that time, 13 false leads were chased. 2 ponds were dredged, and the woman at the center of it all remained in plain sight, under a borrowed name, wearing a borrowed silence. Just like the manuscript's unnamed woman. Was this a cry for help or a demonstration? Was it the act of a writer who lost her footing, or a mind rehearsing a story she never meant to share? Was the disappearance an event or a message? And what happens when that message is finally understood decades later? Here's where the details grow heavier. In the margins of the manuscript disappearance scene, someone wrote a note, handwritten, in pencil, faint, almost too light to see. It says, he will say it was confusion, but it wasn't. No context, no attribution. But the timing of the scene, the details mirrored from 1926, suggests something more than coincidence. Could this be a veiled response? A counter-narrative to the public explanation? Was this the one place Christie allowed herself to record her version, and censored, hidden in metaphor, sealed in fiction, wrapped in story and left unread? Until now, another line, near the end of the same chapter, reads, "She chose the place because it had no memory of her. That was the point, to be seen without being known, to be alive but unclaimed." Who thinks like that? Who writes like that? A character? Or someone who experienced it? Someone who vanished not from fear, but for control, and once they had seen what they needed to see, returned, because the performance was over. But there's one more clue, one more thread that hasn't been discussed, because it was nearly erased. On the final page of the manuscript's disappearance chapter, a date is written in the top right corner, in blue ink, unlike the rest. The date? December 2nd, 1926. One day before Christie vanished, and one day after she had a public argument with her husband. That date has no narrative reason to be in the manuscript. It is not referenced in the story. It appears only once, and it is not crossed out. It is preserved, deliberately, almost left as a breadcrumb, a silent marking that says, this is where it started, not the mystery, not the manuscript, but something else, a decision, a disappearance, a test of what the world would do when a woman removed herself from her own narrative, and what the silence would reveal in her absence. What do you think happened on the night she vanished? Was it a rehearsal, a statement, or something darker that couldn't be spoken, only written down and burned later? Let us know, because the next chapter changes everything. Chapter 12. Who was watching Miss Marple? For most of her life, Agatha Christie observed. That was her strength. She noticed the pauses in conversations, the hesitations between lies, the way a glance could unravel an entire alibi if you were paying attention. She gave us Miss Marple, the unassuming figure who watched from lace-curtained windows, who understood human nature so well she could read the end of a story before it had even started. But here's a question we've never thought to ask. While she was watching, who was watching her? For years, Christie's world was one of fiction. Paperbacks, stage lights, crime scenes that began and ended at her typewriter. But outside the margins of her stories, the real world was shifting. War had changed everything. Information had become more valuable than gold. Secrets became currency. And anyone who paid too much attention was quietly watched in return. Recently declassified files, released under the UK Public Records Act, reveal something extraordinary, something that until now had only existed as rumor among biographers and conspiracy theorists. A document, stamped, dated 1951, from the British Security Service, marked, subject, writer, female, non-compliant, and on the next line, observation warranted due to unauthorized access to restricted operational terms through fiction. They never named her directly. But further in the file, there's a note. Typewritten, uneven, references in her recent publication match names and descriptions of operatives from declassified Operation T. Coincidence not yet determined. They don't use her name. But the publication in question? Destination unknown. A novel Christie published in 1954, set partly in Morocco, filled with shadowy agencies, hidden facilities, and people disappearing in ways official records refuse to acknowledge. Critics called it a creative departure, but someone in intelligence saw something else, and they weren't the only ones. A second file, dated 3 years later, refers to a woman with access to foreign locations and unusually accurate logistics. The analyst comments, claims of imagination are insufficient. Her material aligns with field-based operational reports dated between 1947 and 1950. Further scrutiny recommended. These were not book reviews. They were surveillance summaries, filed alongside documents referencing Eastern Bloc watch lists, radio signal triangulations, and a term typed in all caps, fictionalized infractions, a term that appears nowhere in literary criticism. But it does appear 3 times in military psychological warfare manuals from the early 1950s. Each time, It refers to a tactic in which classified details are obscured under the guise of fiction, not to reveal secrets, but to encode messages. So now we ask, was Agatha Christie a storyteller, or something more? And was Miss Marple just a character, or a carefully disguised messenger? Because here's what we now know. Christie's movements after World War II were inconsistent with her public persona. She traveled extensively. Egypt, Morocco, Iraq. She often wrote that she was researching for novels, but passenger manifests reveal, in certain cases, she traveled under different names. Pseudonyms. The most common, Teresa M. Vale. No one knows what the M stood for, but it appears in Hotel Guestbook in Beirut. 2 years before she wrote, They Came to Baghdad, a novel involving missing agents and a secret plot to destabilize post-war diplomacy. That book was published in 1951, the same year her surveillance file was opened. Could a fiction writer truly know too much? And if so, how? Was Christie gifted? Lucky? Or had she seen something? Heard something? Been told something? Or had someone spoken carelessly, not realizing that a woman who wrote about poison and parlor rooms also knew how to listen, how to remember, how to encode? Because that's what the file suggests. Not accusation, but concern. There's another detail buried in a redacted briefing. The paragraph is heavily blocked, but one phrase remains intact. It reads, Subject maintains correspondence with a female associate codenamed Marigold, believed to be civilian. Shows high capacity for deduction. Possible fictional avatar. A fictional avatar. They didn't just think she was writing secrets. They thought she was splitting them into characters. And Marigold, a flower famously associated with Miss Marple. Was Marigold real? A person? A cipher? Or the device? Was Miss Marple an encoded identity, used to trace people, places, or even events? And if so, was someone using those books as maps? Or worse, were they warnings? Let's go back to the manuscript. The unpublished one, the one that's guided us through every chapter so far. There's a moment near the end. Page 147. Marple is alone. The house is quiet. She walks to a drawer, opens it, and removes a folder labeled simply, Lark. That word never appears again. It's not explained. It's not tied to any known event, except in one of the declassified MI5 documents. Operation Lark is referenced in a footnote, a failed surveillance test, abandoned due to compromised narratives. That phrase again, narratives. They weren't watching for leaks. They were watching stories, fictions that looked too familiar, plots that mirrored real-world plans before they were announced. Can fiction predict real events? Or does fiction sometimes reflect a truth that can't be told outright? Do writers absorb more than we think? Not by spying, but by listening? And if someone saw too much, wouldn't they write it down? But not plainly. Disguised, encoded, tested, left behind like a trail of breadcrumbs, waiting for someone brave enough to follow. In 1967, a handwritten note was found tucked into the back of Christie's desk drawer. Unpublished, unmarked, folded twice. It read, I wasn't followed until I started writing what I saw. Before that, no one noticed. Now I must pretend it's all stories, even when it's not. It was unsigned, but in the corner was a doodle, a small sketch of a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a teacup, and beside her, 3 letters, MM, Miss Marple, or someone else entirely. Someone who had been watching quietly, not just characters, but readers and watchers, and those who watched in return. So we ask again, who was watching Miss Marple? And who was watching Agatha Christie? Was it only readers, fans, critics, or something else? Because when fiction speaks too close to truth, it stops being entertainment. It becomes signal. And sometimes, signals are intercepted, and the sender placed under observation. Not accused, not charged, just watched, carefully, quietly, endlessly. Do you think she knew that someone was reading her books not for story, but for something else? Do you think she wrote anyway? knowing each line could be misunderstood or understood a little too well. Was Christie protecting herself or warning us? Let us know what you think, because we're nearly at the end, and the final chapter doesn't read like fiction at all. Chapter 13, the ending that never was. Some endings arrive suddenly. A door closing, a line finishing, a moment wrapping itself around a truth we thought we were ready for. And some endings never arrive at all. They hesitate, they falter, they stop mid-sentence, leaving just enough behind to make us wonder what would have come next if someone hadn't taken the page away. This is one of those endings, the ending that never was. We've followed the pages. We've studied the characters. We've searched the gardens of fireplaces, the redacted files, the fingerprints in fiction that shouldn't have matched anything real. And now here we are, the final pages, or what remains of them, because the manuscript we've traced, layer by layer, clue by clue, doesn't finish. It stops. It cuts itself short. On page 153, the sentence reads, "And just before she turned to run, she saw his face." Then nothing. No punctuation. No continuation. No closure. Just the hyphen. And the silence that followed. As if whoever wrote it stopped not because the story had ended, but because something had interrupted it. So we ask, why would someone like Agatha Christie, a master resolution, a weaver of precision endings, leave a sentence unfinished? Not in a first draft, not in a brainstorming notebook, but in what appears to be the manuscript's final scene, one page away from the back cover. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate, because in that line, so simple, so abrupt, something else was happening. And to understand it, we need to remember everything we've seen. Let's revisit the moments. A manuscript locked in an attic. A cold case from 1947 that mirrors a fictional scene. A brooch with a missing wing. A character named M, who was never introduced, but always watching. A fireplace. Pages half-burned. Coordinates hidden in plain sight. And a final signature. AC. We discovered declassified files that hinted at surveillance. We traced a storyline that followed the shape of a real disappearance. Christie's own vanishing in 1926. We heard from historians who suggested the story wasn't a story at all, but a memory shaped, sharpened, and sealed beneath fiction. And in the center of it all was a manuscript that told too much by refusing to tell everything. Did you catch the clue? The one that wasn't named. The one that didn't announce itself. The one that never needed to say who he was because she saw his face. But we didn't. Who was he? The man in that final sentence. The one she saw before she turned. Was it the groundskeeper who denied hearing anything? The widow whose house faced a greenhouse, whose notes mirrored Marple's logic? Was it someone never mentioned directly, only hinted at through initials and unfinished sentences? Or was it someone else? Someone behind a manuscript, not inside it. Let's look at the structure. Every chapter we've examined has mirrored reality in ways too precise to ignore, from timelines to locations to missing women whose names weren't remembered, but whose habits were transcribed with uncomfortable accuracy. Each thread, the coded names, the overwritten places, the characters who vanish mid-scene, all point to one conclusion. Not a plot twist, not a fictional twist, but a real one, that the manuscript may not have been written to conclude at all. It may have been written to pause, to wait, to let time fill in what fiction could not, which is why, perhaps, the final sentence stops where it does. Because maybe the face she saw wasn't a person. Maybe it was truth itself, the kind you can't write, the kind you can only acknowledge, and then stop. There's something else, one detail we haven't touched. One line found scribbled on the back of the manuscript's final page, barely visible, nearly lost time. It wasn't typed. It wasn't part of the story. It was handwritten in graphite, a note to self. It reads, "If they ever read this, tell them it wasn't supposed to end here." So we ask again, was this story unfinished or erased? And if someone erased it, why? To protect? To conceal? To wait? Because waiting is what the story feels like. Every page, every silence, every character looking out the window instead of speaking their truth. It wasn't built to deliver an ending. It was built to keep something alive, just long enough for someone else to finish it. Could that someone be you? Could it be all of us? Looking again at clues that didn't seem important at first, rereading the pages where names were half erased, scenes interrupted, but never truly discarded, because in that sentence, and just before she turned to run, she saw his face. There is an invitation, not to close the book, but to open it again, and this time to look for what's missing, not what's there, but what should have been. Here is the final revelation. The missing page, the one that was supposed to follow that half sentence, it was found, not in the manuscript, not in a file, but in a personal notebook Christie kept near the end of her life, filed under private miscellaneous, tucked behind a receipt, a library card, and a photo of an unknown woman. The page was torn, crinkled, but legible. It begins not with words, but with a sketch, a hallway, a door, half open, and beneath it, some faces aren't strangers. They're memories we've locked away, hoping time would keep them there. But time doesn't forget. It remembers differently. And when she saw him, she remembered everything. Then a line drawn across the page, a signature, and under it, one final note, not addressed to a character, not to a publisher, but to the reader. And it reads, I cannot write what came next, because it happened. What happened? We will never know, not entirely, but we know it was enough. Enough to leave the story without an ending, enough to make her stop mid-sentence, and leave the rest of us. Final chapter, the case that watches you back. We always think we're the ones doing the watching. We pick up the books. We trace the clues. We stare through the keyhole. We listen to the cracks in the wall. But what if all this time, we were the ones being watched? What if the case was watching us? We've traveled through every silence, every redacted line, every sentence that stopped too soon. We followed Marple's shadow through forgotten gardens, coded letters, rooms with chairs turned toward empty fireplaces. We've read the manuscript that shouldn't exist, and listened to the parts it never wanted to say aloud. And now we're here, not at the conclusion, but at the reflection, where the mystery turns around and looks back at us. In every story, there comes a moment when the detective steps away from the evidence, when the final clue has been placed on the table, and the silence becomes louder than the truth. In this story, that moment is now, but there's no one to explain it. No Marple to offer a theory from her lace-draped sitting room. No Christie to close the typewriter lid and remind us it was all fiction, because fiction doesn't leave real coordinates in forests. Fiction doesn't mimic missing persons reports. Fiction doesn't end its final line with a hyphen and walk away. Not unless it was watching to see what we do with it. So what we missed? Let's ask the question one last time. If Miss Marple were real, not fictional, not metaphorical, but real, what would she be warning us about today? Because she always warned, but never shouted. She never accused. She simply noticed. And if she were here, right now, what would she be watching? Would she be watching us as we scroll past stories we don't want to read? Would she be watching how quickly we forget the people who vanish without explanation, as long as it's quiet? Would she be watching the way truth is dressed up in fiction, and no one thinks to question why it fits so well? Or would she be watching us? You, me, all of us, the readers, the watchers, the ones who think they're safe behind the page. What if she never stopped watching? Because someone had to. Here's something we haven't said yet. Something we've held until now. Not for drama, but because some truths need time. In one of Christie's unpublished notebooks, a margin note reads, she kept the file open, not because she wanted to solve it, but because she was waiting for someone to see what she saw. What did she see? She never wrote it down, but she left the silence there, waiting. So now we replay, just once more, to ask the question, did you miss this? The greenhouse scene, when the brooch was placed on the windowsill. Not thrown, not lost, placed, The cold case, where the police sketch showed initials JW, and the manuscript echoed them without explanation. The unfinished line, and just before she turned to run, she saw his face. But we never saw it, because maybe it wasn't for us. The code name, Marigold, a flower, but also a message, linked to both Miss Marple and an unidentified associate in MI5's own files. And the photograph, Christie on a bench, pen in hand, looking not at the camera, but past it, as if watching something just out of frame. M, then A, then R, then blank, like the name wasn't supposed to be finished, just like the story, just like the case. This isn't about answers anymore. It never was. It's about echoes, about how stories never really end. They just wait for someone to find the rest, like the missing page, like the unburned corner, like the note hidden behind the mirror. And maybe that's what Miss Marple knew all along. That mystery isn't about solving. It's about seeing what others don't, seeing what's been forgotten, and seeing yourself reflected in the story. Because this case, it doesn't close. It lingers, and in its final moment, it watches you. Maybe it wasn't the mystery that killed the truth. Maybe the truth was too clever to stay dead. She never left the room. She just stopped being noticed.